Hello, Geography 231 students. Welcome to week 4 of our class. This week we're going to be talking about census data this week and next week. This is your lecture. I've also posted a video for the tutorial. Go ahead and check that out after you watch this lecture video. Shouldn't be more than, say, 30 minutes tops. Just basically, this lecture provides a primer on the census, the decennial census. It talks a little bit about the American Community Survey, which is a census survey that goes on throughout the decade instead of once every 10 years. The Census Bureau is calling people throughout the year and making other data sets from a larger data set. I talk a little bit about downloading data, how to access it online, how to join it in ArcGIS Pro, and a little bit of census history as well. So relatively short lecture. We're going to do census data this week and next week. This week's lab requires you to access data online, pull both the census tables and the spatial data files from the Bureau, format them in Excel. So hopefully everybody has access to Excel. If not, you might be able to do this in Google Sheets. Once the data is formatted, you're going to bring it into ArcGIS Pro, and then it'll be more or less your typical cartography aspect. So you're going to join the files together in ArcGIS Pro, and then you're going to symbolize choropleth map. Graduated colors is another word for that, to display median household incomes. Two different maps, one for Orange County and the other one for the United States as a whole. So that's what today's lab entails. And then next week, we're going to continue on census data, and we're going to do a little bit more spatial analysis, looking at not just distributions, but also some correlations as well. Okay. All right. So this week, Geography 231, spatial analysis, week 4, census data. So today's lecture, census data, the tutorial lab, working with census data. Upon completion of this lecture and lab, you should understand the history and purpose of the U.S. Census, how to access and download data from the Census Bureau, how to join spatial and non-spatial tabular data in ArcGIS Pro, and how to create map layout design concepts in ArcPro. So this may be the first time you've actually created a map layout with all the various map elements, the north arrow, legend, title, all of that. So you'll do that in this lab as well once you get to it. Okay. All right, so first and foremost, what is the census? So in one single sentence, the census is a count of every man, woman, and child residing in the United States of America. That is at its core what the census is. Now, obviously, the Bureau is able to take these counts and combine them with other statistical measures and questions to combine to create huge data sets of spatially connected data. All right. So essentially, beyond the single count of who is here, it's also about what is it like to be an American citizen in terms of the demographic profiles by age and sex, race and ethnicity, income, housing type, industry of employment. All these various demographic indicators are tracked by the Census Bureau. All right. So the census, the decennial census, is mandated by the U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 2, which reads, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers. Obviously, the bold is added by me here to highlight the important aspects. The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States, and within every subsequent term of 10 years, which is why we call it the decennial census, because it is a 10-year event in such manner as they shall by direct law. So that's the key thing here. So decennial censuses happen every 10 years on the zero. All right. So 2000, 2010, 2020. And the outcome of the 100% count, the count of every man, woman, and child, is that those data can then be used to apportion or reapportion representative districts, primarily congressional districts, state senate, state assembly, school districts, boards of supervisors, you name it, any district, water districts. They rely on what's known as Public Law File 94-171. So that is the 100% count data for any location in the United States. So the key purpose is apportioning the U.S. House of Representatives, and then on down the line in terms of representative districts in the U.S. It helps determine the number of seats that each state receives in the House of Representatives. So if a state has more people, they in theory get more representatives. So it's always interesting after a decennial census to pay attention to the number of representatives that each state received, because sometimes states receive more and sometimes they might lose one. That actually happened in 2010. And so if a state loses too much population, which happened through the kind of the Rust Belt part of the country, states may lose a representative, because it's all about proportional representation. So as some states grow, they gain representatives. As some states shrink, they may lose. Okay, so be aware of that. Okay, so census data is a fundamental element of federal legislation used to draw congressional and state legislative districts, school districts, and voting districts. Also, it helps enforce voting rights and civil rights legislation. There are several pieces of legislation in the United States that essentially mandate every single person be counted. This lines up with the Voting Rights Act, Title VI, Title IX, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Age Discrimination Act. Census data help inform federal, tribal, state, and local government planning decisions. All right, so you have to know who, how many, and who lives in your jurisdiction in order to plan for the future. Helps inform business and nonprofit organization decisions. For example, where to locate a new business, maybe find out something about the size of the market. So you might be hearing these words and thinking, oh, this sort of sounds like a job for GIS, right? Well, indeed, the GIS, it plays a major role, not just in using census data, but actually collecting census data as well, which we'll talk about in a bit, okay? Lastly, census data help provide population benchmarks for nearly every other United States survey. So every other survey that occurs here, maybe it's about economics or some other non-question topic, or a topic that's not necessarily discussed in the census, those questions or surveys are then benchmarked to the decennial census, because the decennial census is the gold standard for the simple answer to the question, how many people live in the United States? Okay. Census data are essential to funded programs. So the census helps determine appropriation of over $675 billion per year in federal funds spent on schools, hospitals, roads, public works, and other infrastructure like dams, freeways, electrical grids, things like that. So again, having an accurate count of how many people live in any given location is instrumental in determining who and what jurisdictions receive those valuable federal funds, right? And I've got a little sample table here, 10 largest census guided assistance programs. This is for fiscal year 2008. Obviously, these numbers are no longer relevant, but medical assistance program for the Department of Health and Human Services received $261 billion in formula grants. Highway planning and construction went to the Department of Transportation. They received over 36 billion, and on down the list. So as you can see, just massive dollars here that are all apportioned based off of census counts. All right, a brief history. So the first U.S. Census was held in 1790, all the way back. So not too long after our entire country we gained independence, and then our Constitution was written, so it dates back to when I believe George Washington was still president. So the first census was administered by the Secretary of State at the time, who was Thomas Jefferson, obviously a very important character in the development of the United States. And before there were professional census enumerators, people who went out, knocked on doors to ask for how many people lived in your household, it was actually the federal marshals who counted the population. Initially, the federal marshals, they were tasked with going out to all the original states and knocking on doors, but they allegedly were not provided with paper and pencils themselves, and so they actually had to come up with their own. And so a lot of the numbers from the 1790 census were collected on the backs of other pieces, other documents, and scrap paper, things like that. So it was not a very super well organized census, certainly not by modern standards. And so the numbers are there's probably some fairly significant margin of error, but the numbers are what we have. There's no other alternative. So what we have here are as follows. So the first census asked the number of free white males 16 and over, free white males under 16, free white females, all other free persons, and then slaves. Okay. And so as you can see, it was literally only those 5 questions, and it was asked of all the original states at the time. Okay. So the question counts have obviously expanded and grown over time, but interesting data point here. The total population in 1790 was 3,929,214, of which 694,000 were slaves. So the slave population comprised over 17% of the U.S. population in 1790. So the census was conducted every 10 years following the first census, and has not missed a year since. So we've had, I believe, be 24 censuses, or will be 24 this year. Questions expanded over the decades to include many more, such as about age and sex of household members, agricultural, mining, and fishing statistics, so basically industry-related questions, questions about taxation, which varied from state to state, number of churches and churchgoers, and crime statistics. So this is obviously before the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and so crime data were also collected by the U.S. Marshals. So here is just a bar chart to show the U.S. population growth from 1790 to 2020. It's actually fairly linear looking growth. You can see just kind of a minor dip there during the war years, during World War II. It's still, growth continues, but at a slower pace, then a big jump in the 90s. And so, but beyond that, it's fairly consistent, not linear, but not exactly exponential either. So that 330 million number is actually an estimate. We will find out what the 100% count of the U.S. is no later than December 31st of this year. We'll get that first total. All right, so what is the structure of the census in 2020? So the 2020 census required years of research, planning, and development of methods and infrastructure to ensure an accurate and complete count. The Census Bureau has a large number of programs that it runs before the census ever takes place. And we're talking about going back to the year 2011, 2012. The census has been fine-tuning its geographies, like the actual spatial boundaries it uses to tabulate people. It's gone out to local jurisdictions and asked for their own GIS data so that they can make these boundaries more accurate. They've got this program called the Count Question Resolution Program, where jurisdictions can contact the Census Bureau and dispute counts. Like, let's say a city has more or fewer houses than the census reported in the previous decennial census. They can dispute those numbers. Local area boundary, like I said, updates, all these various things. So the census is always fine-tuning its methods. And so this 2020 census was, I would say, they put the most work into the 2020 census of any in terms of making the data as accurate as possible before any single person was actually counted. Okay. And so the 2020 census is counting a population of approximately 330 million people and more than 140 million housing units. So a housing unit can be a single family home, an apartment, a duplex, triplex, condo. It can also be people who live homeless, people who don't have homes. So that the Bureau actually makes an effort to count homeless individuals as well. So those who might have kind of a mobile lifestyle, they live in a tent or under a bridge or whatever the case may be. Every single man, woman, and child in the country must be counted for the census. And so the Bureau goes to great lengths to capture those numbers. And the 2020 census relies on the internet more than any previous census to increase self-response. And it makes sense, obviously, as technology develops, so too do the methods that the census employs. But this year, they're really relying on the internet a lot more to help facilitate responses. So despite greater access to technology than ever before in American history, the 2020 census faces many logistical challenges. For example, fiscal constraints. This is in the current budget situation in the United States. There is less money to go around to federal programs. Distrust in government. So that's an interesting thing that's not new to 2020, but it certainly has grown a lot, certainly in my lifetime. Just a general distrust that if a census enumerator comes to your house, they're asking you about your personal life, and people tend to a bit ironically have a problem with that, because then they'll go log on to Facebook, where Facebook or Google knows everything about them, from their favorite restaurant to their pet's name to their children and their grandchildren. So it's a bit of a kind of counterintuitive situation, but people distrust the government even though their personal information remains private, and you yourself are never disclosed in the census. It's an aggregation of people. And then on the other hand, we give out all of our information online. So that's just kind of the funny thing about life in 2020. An explosion in misinformation. So fake news, right? We have a more mobile population than ever before. People are able to move simply because jobs, as you know now, here in 2020, in the middle of a pandemic, you don't have to work in the city where you live. And so that's not always easy to track people down. Lastly, non-traditional living arrangements. Certainly in a poor economy, it's more common for young people to live with their parents, and maybe parents of parents, grandparents might all live in a house. So you might end up with 6, 7, 8 people living in a household, and that's fairly common today. That being said, GIS is playing a major role in the 2020 census. Some of the various programs I mentioned before, like the Count Question Resolution Program, they've essentially improved the National Address Geodatabase so that it's easier for enumerators to locate houses and count the people there. And jurisdictions obviously provide input throughout the 10-year period. So I've been talking only about the decennial census up to this point. There's also something that's known as the American Community Survey, or the ACS. The American Community Survey is an ongoing survey that provides data every year and in 3- and 5-year estimates. Essentially, it combines the decennial 100% count numbers with a small sample, specifically a sample of about 1 in 6 individuals, which creates timely information updated yearly or every 3 years or every 5 years. So instead of only relying on the data that comes out every 10 years, the ACS provides data more frequently than that. ACS data help to determine appropriation of over $400 billion in federal and state funds each year. And the ACS actually is fairly new. It really got going after the 2010 census. ACS, the goal is to help communities, state governments, and federal programs. In order to do so, they ask questions about age, sex, race, family and relationships, income and benefits, health insurance, education, veteran status, disabilities, where somebody works and how they get there, the commuting method, and where they live and how much they pay for essentials like rent and groceries and things like that. So there's a lot of very rich data that comes out of the ACS, very interesting data. In fact, in today's lab, we're actually going to be relying on ACS data. And so ACS data, as I said, it's more timely than the decennial census, but because it relies on a smaller sample size, there is a higher margin of error. So you just inherent in the data, you have to accept there's going to be a higher margin of error. But sometimes it's not such an issue. It just depends on what task you're trying to accomplish. This is just a sample ACS questionnaire. So what are some of the differences between the ACS and the decennial census? So they're incomparable in terms of sample size and timeliness. The ACS is designed for timely statistics with a higher margin of error, as I mentioned. The decennial census data is designed for a complete picture of the entire U.S. population with a very low margin of error, but the data tend to lose value over time. So imagine today in 2020, before the 2020 census data have been released, it's been 10 years since there's been a 100% count of everybody. So if you rely on 2020 decennial census data, it's great because it provides a whole picture of what the US was like 10 years ago. But if you're trying to get an accurate representation of what a neighborhood or a town is like today, you're less likely to get that from decennial census data because it's simply outdated. Different variable definitions, data collection methods, and reporting. As I said, 1 in 6 people versus 100%. Monthly surveys require different reference periods, and as I mentioned, there's a higher margin of error with the ACS versus the decennial census. So how do we access census data? So just in the last year, the Census Bureau has phased out the previous interface, which is known as the American Fact Finder website, and they have phased in what's just referred to as data.census.gov. Okay, so a really simple URL to remember. Essentially, you can search by table name if you know it. You can search by topic, geographic area, in many other methods. And so in today's lab, you're gonna actually search via a couple of different methods, okay? And so clicking on that advanced search button actually provides a way to browse data. So if you don't know what the table name is, or you don't know what geographic area or topic you're looking for, you can actually kind of browse, just like you go on Amazon. Maybe you don't know what kind of headphones you're looking for, you can just browse headphones and look at different types, right? So same thing with data.census.gov. And this is just a couple of screenshots here. In this case, ultimately what we're looking at are all, I believe this is census tracts in Orange County. So you choose your geographic level, then where within what state, and then within which county, and then in this case this would be census tracts. This is different data tables. In this case here, we're looking at sex by age. And so there's sex by age, white alone, African American, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian alone, so on and so forth. There are literally hundreds of tables. This is just one screenshot. So the search bar is actually pretty good. So type in as much information as you can, and that will help narrow down the data set that you're looking for. Here's just a screenshot of what a data table looks like. This is a breakdown of number of, in this case here, Black or African American people in Orange County. And so we've got by census tract here, and this is just a quick table that you can then customize and you can transpose for GIS. And so if you click on customize table, you can change it up, and then you can download the data. So if you hit that customize button, you can choose the different data sets. There's a whole bunch of different customization options up here, which you can just kind of play around with, and then you click on that download there to download the data. Once it's been downloaded, you can then view it and format it in Excel, where you're going to be using Excel for this lab. And so some data sets have a ton of columns of data, just tons and tons, hundreds even, and others have maybe 2 or 3. But in any data set, you will always have that first column there, geo_ID. And geo-IDs, what those are unique geographic identifiers that allow you to join this census tabular data to a corresponding GIS shapefile. Okay, so both in the geographic spatial data and in this tabular non-spatial data, they'll have a matching ID field. Sometimes the field names are different, but the contents need to be the same in order to do a join. So what sort of cleanup tasks might you do in Microsoft Excel? Change field names, remove unwanted rows or columns, truncate data fields, perform standardization techniques, create new data sets, and then import into a table geodatabase. You actually do that through ArcMap or ArcPro, but you can format it and prep it for importing in Excel. All right, so we've talked about accessing the tabular data. What about the spatial data? And so to access geographic boundary data or spatial data, we use the Census Tiger Line Shapefiles website. Now the URL is a bit opaque. It's not really a clean URL like data.census.gov. So I just tell students just to do a Google search for Tiger Line Shapefiles, and it's always the first result on Google. But what you find are spatial data, and they represent any number of geographic areas, which we'll mention in a second. So spatial data must be joined to tabular data in GIS in order to visualize population counts, distributions, densities, and so on. So anytime you want to actually visually represent tabular data, it has to be joined to a spatial data layer first. So without tabular data, Spatial data are just geographic boundaries. And without spatial data, tabular data are just numbers on a spreadsheet. So really, it's a symbiotic relationship, and the two components need one another to paint a whole, complete picture. All right, so different spatial geographic boundaries that are available. Census blocks, which are the smallest foundational unit that the census tabulates data to. Block groups, which are aggregations of blocks. Census tracts, which are aggregations of block groups. Counties, states, school districts, congressional districts. Zip code tabulation areas, which are basically just representations of zip codes, and many other ones. Tribal areas, metropolitan statistical areas. There are countless geographic areas that correspond with those tabular data files. Here's just kind of a visual representation of what block groups and tracts look like. So census data is tabulated at several geographic scales, from national, the largest, all the way down to blocks, which are the smallest. So this here is just an aerial photo from the city of Santa Ana. And here, overlaid on top of the aerial photo, are blocks, and all these numbers are block numbers. And overlaid on top of that are block groups. So you can see that the blocks, the orange boundaries, nest within block groups, which are the pink boundaries. And that's the kind of the whole thing about blocks, block groups, and tracts, is that they nest together, sort of like Russian nesting dolls. And then at the highest level here, we have tracts. So within a tract, in this case, this is tract 750.02. There seem to be 4 block groups, and within those block groups, there are more blocks than I can count with my eye, but quite a few. All right, so how do we join tabular and spatial data? It's pretty straightforward. So essentially, you first have to add the boundary file into ArcGIS Pro. You will then right-click the layer in the contents pane, and then highlight joins and relates, then add a join. And then essentially what it does is it looks at that GeoID field I mentioned earlier. So both the spatial data, in this case here, the Orange County block groups, and the tabular data, the census data, and this is household income over here, they both have a matching GeoID field. And so in Geography 230, hopefully you learned about the concept of cardinality, one-to-one cardinality, one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many, all these different forms of cardinality. And what cardinality are essentially relationships between joining features. Okay, so if it's a one-to-one cardinality, that means for every block group, there's one matching record in the counted household income data. All right, so one visual or one spatial area has a corresponding household income, and they join together on that GeoID field with a one-to-one correspondence, cardinal correspondence. And this is here on the left-hand side sort of represents the spatial data. On the right-hand side represents the count data. It's actually the other way around, sorry. Left-hand side is the count data, right-hand side is the spatial data. They join together, and so both feature, class, and tabular data have that 06, 059, et cetera, field there, and so they join together. So this is the boundary data pre-join, and this is the boundary data after join. After you've been joined together, you can then take that, in this case here, household income data, and you can spatially symbolize it. You can basically say, okay, in this case here, these block groups have higher incomes, these block groups have lower incomes, and that's just the beginning of this. There are many different ways that you can use census data to pull out more and more information. So this week, we're just going to be doing kind of a visual analysis, and then next week, we're actually going to use some spatial analysis tools looking at correlation between data layers. So that concludes this week's lecture. When you're finished with this, you can obviously jump into the tutorial if you'd like, or take a break, whatever. There's no reading this week, just the lab and the lecture. And once again, have a great week, and talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.